James Morrison had been driving trucks for 20 years, but he'd never seen a storm quite like this one. The January blizzard had descended without warning, transforming the Interstate 80 through Nebraska into a treacherous white void. His 18-wheeler pushed through the darkness like a ship lost at sea, the wind howling against the cabin with an almost human-like wail. The clock on his dashboard read 2:47 a.m., and he hadn't seen another vehicle for the past hour. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the relentless snow, creating hypnotic arcs that seemed to dance with the swirling flakes in his high beams. James took another sip of his now cold coffee, trying to stay alert. The radio had long since devolved into static, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the steady rumble of his engine. He'd promised his dispatcher he'd make it to Des Moines by morning, but now that seemed like a fool's errand. The temperature gauge on his truck showed -15 degrees, and the wind chill would make it feel twice as cold. James had seen what weather like this could do to people, how it could freeze a person solid in less time than it takes to watch a sitcom. He'd heard stories from other drivers about people who'd wandered away from broken-down cars, only to be found days later preserved like statues in the merciless prairie winter. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as his high beams caught the reflective markers at the edge of the road, the only thing keeping him from drifting into the darkness beyond. The highway stretched endlessly before him, a white ribbon vanishing into the void of the winter night. Through the dense curtain of snow, James's headlight suddenly caught something that made his heart skip a beat. A dark figure stood at the roadside, arm raised in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. James's first instinct was to keep driving. Only a fool would stop in weather like this, and he'd watched enough true crime documentaries to know better. But something about the figure's desperate stance made him hesitate. The figure stumbled slightly, and James could see now it was a man, his clothes whipping violently in the wind. Against every rule of the road he'd ever learned, James eased his foot onto the brake, feeling the trailer slide slightly before the rig came to a complete stop. He watched in his side mirror as the stranger approached, moving with an unnatural stiffness that James attributed to the cold. The passenger door creaked open, letting in a blast of Arctic air and swirling snow. The man practically fell into the cabin, bringing with him the sharp bite of winter. He was soaked through, his clothes crusted with ice, and his skin had taken on the waxy, pale appearance of severe hypothermia. His dark hair was dusted with snow, and his lips had a bluish tinge that made James immediately reach for the heater controls. "Thanks," the man whispered, his voice barely rising above the howl of the wind. "You saved me." His eyes, when they met James's, seemed to reflect no light at all, like two holes cut into the night itself. Water dripped from his clothes onto the seat, forming small pools that seemed to freeze almost immediately. As the truck lumbered back onto the highway, James tried to make conversation, hoping to distract himself from the growing unease in his gut. "Where were you headed before the storm hit?" he asked, keeping his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The man remained silent for so long that James wondered if he'd heard the question. "Home," came the eventual reply, in that same whispered tone. "Been trying to get there for a while now." Something about the way he said it made James's skin crawl. When he asked where home was, the man just stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop, despite the heater running full blast. James noticed other odd things as the miles crept by. The man's clothes weren't getting any drier, despite the warm air flowing through the vents. No steam rose from his wet garments, and the ice in his hair hadn't melted. When James checked his mirrors to change lanes, he could have sworn he saw empty space where his passenger should have been reflected. The radio, which had been nothing but static, suddenly came to life with a burst of music, an old song from the 1950s, crackling through the speakers. James reached to adjust it, and in that split second when his eyes left the road, he felt the temperature plummet. When he looked back at the passenger seat, it was empty. No wet marks, no sign anyone had been there at all. James slammed on the brakes, the truck fishtailing dangerously on the snow-covered asphalt. His heart hammered against his ribs as he scanned the cabin with frantic eyes. The passenger door was still firmly closed, and there was no way anyone could have jumped out at highway speeds without him noticing. The seat beside him was bone dry, as if the soaking wet man had never existed. His hands trembling, James reached for his flashlight, sweeping its beam across the cabin. No footprints marked the floor, no water had pooled anywhere. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the idling engine. Then, movement caught his eye in the rearview mirror. His blood turned to ice as he saw the man sitting in the exposed truck bed, snow swirling around him undisturbed, as if he was part of the storm itself. The man's face was different now, gray and mottled, with dark hollows where his eyes should be. His clothes were tattered and frozen solid, like he'd been lying in a snowbank for days. As James watched, paralyzed with terror, the figure slowly turned its head to face him, its mouth opening in an impossible black grin that seemed to swallow all light. Emma screamed. It screamed as loudly as might. James didn't remember most of the drive to the next town. He'd pressed the accelerator to the floor and kept it there, his mind refusing to process what he'd seen. He didn't stop until he reached a truck stop outside of Des Moines, where he finally allowed himself to collapse into a booth at the diner, his hands shaking as he wrapped them around a cup of coffee. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, noticed his distress and sat down across from him. When he finally managed to tell her what had happened, she didn't laugh or dismiss him. Instead, her face grew serious. She told him about Tommy Wheeler, a local man who died on that stretch of highway during the blizzard of 1957. They'd found his body 3 days later, frozen solid where he'd fallen after his car broke down. He'd been trying to walk home. Over the years, other drivers had reported similar experiences. A desperate figure in the snow, a mysterious passenger who vanished, leaving no trace behind. Some said it was Wheeler's ghost, still trying to complete his final journey home. Others believed the brutal winter storms of the Midwest sometimes tore holes in the fabric between worlds, allowing things to slip through that had no business walking among the living. James never drove that stretch of I-80 at night again, and when winter storms approached, he made sure to be safely off the road before darkness fell. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls outside his window, he finds himself wondering about that mysterious passenger. Was it truly the ghost of Tommy Wheeler, forever seeking a ride home, or was it something else? Something that wore Wheeler's face as a mask, using his tragic story to lure good Samaritans into stopping on dark, stormy nights. In the end, James decided some questions were better left unanswered. But he never picked up another hitchhiker, and he never forgot the sound of that empty, whistling laugh that seemed to follow his truck through the darkness, carried on the winter wind. He arrived on the winter wind. The February wind howled through the Minnesota pines like a wounded animal as Ethan Mitchell guided his Honda Civic along the isolated back road. What had started as a routine drive back from Chicago had turned into a nightmare of whiteout conditions and failing technology. He'd always found beauty in winter drives, the way snow transforms familiar landscapes into crystalline wonderlands, the peaceful solitude of empty roads. But tonight was different. Tonight, the winter seemed alive and malevolent. His GPS had been acting erratic for the past hour, the computerized voice growing increasingly distorted before dying completely. The main highway had been closed due to the storm, forcing him onto this narrow forest road that twisted through dense woods like a frozen serpent. His fuel gauge hovered just above empty, each glance at it sending a fresh wave of anxiety through his chest. The trees pressed close to the road, their snow-laden branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. In the growing darkness, their shadows seemed to move independently of the wind, dancing and twisting in ways that made Ethan question his perception. He'd driven these Minnesota backroads his entire life, but something about this particular stretch felt wrong, as if he'd somehow crossed an invisible boundary into somewhere else entirely. Just as panic began to set in, his headlights caught the faded signs of a gas station ahead. The building seemed to materialize out of the storm like a mirage. A small, weather-beaten structure with a single pump out front. The windows glowed with a sickly yellow light that barely penetrated the frost-covered glass. Ethan pulled in, his tires crunching over what felt like years of accumulated ice beneath the fresh snow. That's when he saw it. A figure standing motionless at the edge of the tree line. Even through the swirling snow, something about its stillness seemed unnatural, as if it were a hole cut into the fabric of reality. The figure wore what appeared to be clothing from another era, a long dark coat and high boots that might have been fashionable half a century ago. Ethan tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees, but then it moved, just slightly, its head turning to track his movement with mechanical precision. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees as Ethan stepped out of his car. The wind had died completely, leaving behind an unnatural silence, broken only by the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots. Up close, the gas pump looked ancient, its digital display cracked and dark. When he pressed the buttons, they felt brittle, as if they might crumble beneath his fingers. With growing desperation, Ethan tried to get the pump working, but it remained stubbornly lifeless. All the while, he could feel the figure's gaze boring into him from the tree line. He refused to look directly at it, but in his peripheral vision he could see it hadn't moved. Except for its head, which continued to follow his every movement like a grotesque weather vane. The station's interior beckoned with its sickly light, and Ethan finally surrendered to the inevitable. The door creaked open on frozen hinges, releasing a blast of stale air that carried the scent of old dust and something else, something sweet and metallic that reminded him disturbingly of frozen blood. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed and flickered, creating the unsettling impression that reality itself was stuttering. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with products whose labels had faded to illegibility. A layer of frost coated everything, patterns of ice crystals spreading across surfaces like living things. His breath came out in thick clouds, despite being indoors. Behind the counter, the wall of photographs stopped him cold. Dozens of faces stared out from behind clouded glass and warped frames, each photo showing a different person standing in front of the station. But something was wrong with the images. The people's expressions were uniform, wide-eyed, strained, as if they'd been caught in a moment of dawning horror. And in every single photo, that same figure stood in the background, near the tree line, watching. The clothing changed slightly from picture to picture, evolving through the decades, but the figure's pose remained identical, and in none of the photos could its face be clearly seen. The sound of movement outside made Ethan spin around. Through the frosted windows, he could see the figure had moved closer to his car, standing perfectly still beside the passenger door. Its head was slightly tilted, like a curious animal studying something it didn't quite understand. The sight sent waves of primal terror through Ethan's body. He bolted for his car, the cold air burning his lungs as he ran. Inside the vehicle, his trembling hands struggled with the keys. The engine turned over once, twice, but wouldn't catch. Each failed attempt was accompanied by a sound that seemed less like a normal starter and more like a creature in pain. The figure began to move toward him with a peculiar gait, smooth and continuous, as if it were gliding rather than walking. Its feet left no impressions in the fresh snow. As it drew closer, Ethan could see details he wished he hadn't. The way its clothes seemed to move wrong, as if they were empty, the strange angularity of its movements. The darkness within its hood where a face should be. His phone showed no signal, but the screen kept lighting up with notifications from numbers that were impossibly long, each containing the same message: stay. The temperature inside the car plummeted until his breath came out in crystalline clouds. Ice began forming on the inside of the window, spreading in patterns that looked disturbingly like reaching hands. The figure was now close enough that its shadow fell across Ethan's lap. He could hear something coming from within its hood, a sound like wind whistling through hollow spaces, or perhaps distant echoing whispers. The ice on his windows had nearly obscured his view entirely when the engine finally roared to life. Ethan floored the accelerator, his tires spinning on the ice before finding purchase. The car fishtailed wildly as he sped away from the station, but he didn't dare slow down. In his rearview mirror, he could see the figure standing in the middle of the road, its dark form highlighted by his taillights. Despite the distance he was putting between them, it seemed to remain the same size in his mirror, as if it were somehow keeping pace while remaining perfectly still. The radio suddenly crackled to life, emitting a sound like static mixed with breaking ice. Through the interference, a voice began to speak, not through the speakers, but seemingly from the very air around him. It whispered his name in a voice that sounded like cracking frost, growing louder with each repetition. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The vents, the windows, even the engine itself. Horror overtook him as he realized the ice forming on his windows wasn't spreading randomly. It was forming words, names, dates, dozens of them, hundreds, all appearing and disappearing like frost-bitten Morse code. He recognized some of the dates from the photographs in the station. Through his increasingly obscured windshield, Ethan suddenly saw the figure standing in the middle of the road ahead, exactly as it had appeared in his rearview mirror moments before. Its hood was finally pulled back, revealing nothing. Not darkness, not a face, but an absence. A void in the shape of a head that seemed to pull at Ethan's vision like a black hole. The car spun out as he swerved to avoid it, sliding off the road and into a deep snowbank. The impact left him dazed, blood from a cut on his forehead freezing almost instantly in the supernatural cold. As his vision cleared, he saw the figure standing outside his window, its empty hood peering in at him. The door locks began cycling up and down on their own, and Ethan realized with mounting horror that they were counting down. The next morning, state troopers responding to reports of an abandoned vehicle found Ethan's car buried in the snow. The interior was completely frozen over, ice several inches thick coating every surface. There was no sign of Ethan, save for a single set of footprints leading away from the car. Footprints that stopped abruptly after several yards, as if their maker had simply vanished. When they ran the coordinates, they found no record of a gas station ever existing in the area. Local historians, however, told stories of a place that used to exist along that stretch of road. A refuge for travelers that burned down in the winter of 1957, the fire had claimed the life of its owner, a reclusive man who was known for his strange habit of photographing every customer who stopped there. Every few years, especially during particularly harsh winters, people would report seeing lights through the trees where the station once stood. Some claimed to have pulled into a mysterious old gas station during snowstorms, only to find it gone when they tried to return. A few survived to tell their tales. Others simply vanished, leaving behind cars with interiors frozen solid and collections of mysterious photographs that seemed to appear and disappear like frost on a winter morning. The photographs in Ethan's wallet were found completely intact, though frozen solid. When they thawed, observers noticed something chilling. In the background of his driver's license photo, barely visible but unmistakable, stood a dark figure near a line of trees, watching. And on particularly cold nights, travelers on that stretch of road sometimes report seeing two figures now, standing motionless among the trees, one tall and dark, the other younger, wearing modern winter clothing, both watching and waiting for the next visitor to lose their way in the endless Minnesota winter. Winter storms were nothing new for Julia, a young woman in her late 20s who had recently moved to a remote cabin in Montana to finish her novel. Surrounded by towering pine trees and heavy snow, the silence was both inspiring and isolating. On a particularly cold evening in January, the power flickered and went out, plunging her cabin into darkness. Julia wasn't worried. She'd prepared for such situations. Lighting a few candles, she settled by the fireplace and started editing her manuscript. But as the wind howled outside, she noticed something odd, a set of fresh footprints in the snow leading up to her porch. She hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, and her nearest neighbor was miles away. Her pulse quickened. Who would be wandering through a snowstorm to reach her cabin? And why hadn't she heard them knock? Trying to shake off her unease, Julia peered out the window. The tracks ended abruptly at her door, but there was no sign of anyone outside. The storm raged on, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. She decided to lock the doors and windows just in case. Hours later, as she was drifting off to sleep, a faint knock echoed through the cabin. Startled, Julia grabbed her phone, only to see she had no service. Gathering her courage, she called out, "Who's there?" There was no reply, just the sound of the wind and a strange scraping noise near the back door. Julia's breath caught. Someone or something was out there. The knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, growing louder and more insistent. Julia stayed by the fireplace, clutching a poker for protection. When morning finally arrived, she stepped outside to investigate. The footprints had multiplied, circling her cabin as though someone had been pacing around all night. Feeling unnerved, Julia decided to leave, but her car wouldn't start. It was buried under snow, and the engine wouldn't even turn over. Trapped, she returned to the cabin, trying to stay calm. That evening, the knocking resumed, this time more violent. Julia shouted into the storm, but her voice was swallowed by the wind. Then, through the flickering candlelight, she saw a figure standing at her back window. The figure was tall and emaciated, with a pale face pressed against the glass. Its hollow eyes met hers, and Julia froze in terror. The stranger smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin. Without warning, the figure slammed a fist against the glass, shattering it. He stumbled backwards through the door and fell to the floor. Julia screamed and ran to the front door, but the knob wouldn't budge. The stranger's footsteps echoed behind her, crunching on broken glass. Grabbing a fire poker, she turned to face him, but the room was empty. The intruder had vanished. Julia survived the night, but the experience left her shaken. When a repair crew arrived days later, they found no footprints, no broken glass, and no evidence of a struggle. Just an icy draft seeping through the cabin. She never stayed there again. To this day, Julia wonders if it was a person, a spirit, or simply her mind playing tricks. But every winter, when the wind howls outside, she swears she can hear that faint knocking once more. Winter may bring serene landscapes and holiday cheer, but as these stories remind us, it can also hide the most chilling of terrors. Which story froze your blood the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you're ready for more spine-tingling tales, click here to watch our next video. Until next time, stay safe and don't let the cold catch you off guard.